Welcome to Lighthouse Keepers, where we explore therapeutic guidance to help you navigate the storms of life. Before we dive in, please remember that while Gina and Charlotte are registered psychotherapists, this podcast is strictly for educational and informational purposes. It is not a substitute for therapy or professional medical advice. If you are experiencing a mental health emergency, please call 988 for Canada's Suicide Crisis Helpline or go to your nearest emergency room.
In our second episode, Gina and Charlotte create a framework and common language to understand the various aspects of the self, as well as the different types of self-experiences we can have. We know how overwhelming it can be to navigate mental health information online. Their mission with this podcast is to deliver grounded, reliable psychoeducation that you can actually trust.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Charlotte.
And I'm Gina, and we are the Lighthouse Keepers.
Join us as we explore how to navigate the storms of life.
What is the self? I break down the self into 5 sort of overarching categories. And of course, this is an oversimplification because we are extremely complex creatures. To me, the primary part of the self is the soul. That's the energy, the vibration, the essence that keeps us alive. It's the part of us that connects to God, source, universe, that concept of the ethereal thing that is larger than all of us, that connects all of us. From that soul enters the observer self, this version of us that is neutral and is here to just observe and experience this life. It doesn't interpret, it doesn't analyze, it simply observes and takes in data as is. And then there's the ego that forms. And the ego, or the mind, is the part of ourself that analyzes and interprets this experience. It makes meaning of all the different things that happens to us. It comprises of all of our lived experiences, but it also comprises of our conditioning and indoctrination, expectations that were placed on us by parents, expectations from culture and tradition, ethnicity and nationality, and all the ways that we as a society expect people to show up. Then there's the part of ourself that experiences emotion, and that's both as the emotional range, but also as sensation. And then there's the part of us that creates defenses against those emotional experiences that we do not know how to reconcile and make peace with. And that defensive self can be a variety of different things, from thoughts to beliefs to behaviors to patterns in relationships that we unconsciously engage in with the intention of managing any unresolved pain that we might have.
Now that you've dove into and given us the highlights of the 5 different parts of self, let's take a minute and dive a little deeper. Let's start with the soul. The soul is something that in science we're just starting to catch up to. Obviously, there's the mystical, the religious, right? Ideas of what a soul is. There's the felt experience. Within neuroscience and within quantum physics, we're now starting to realize and prove that there is a quantifying consciousness or field that permeates all of existence. Some people call it consciousness. Some people call it the 0-point field or 0-point field energy. But technically, why this is important in my eyes is that we all share this same energy imprint. They've now also discovered that energy can't be destroyed, it can only be transformed, and that nothing is lost in the universe.
Right.
And so this has wide-ranging implications, and we could dive into some of the quantum physics, but for this particular episode, I don't think that that's necessary.
No.
But Gina, I'm really curious, why do you feel like the soul is an important thing to explore?
My personal experience with soul and spirit has always been rich. I've, since childhood, understood or had a connection with something bigger than self. I was born and raised as a Catholic. I don't necessarily ascribe to the religion anymore, but there was always this idea of, the Father in the sky, and I was always confused about where the mother was. If there was only a father, it felt incomplete. And I remember as a 10-year-old hiking the foothills of the Himalayas, and I remember arriving just in time to watch sunrise hit Everest. And it was this triangle in the distance, literally looked like clouds with a golden triangle at the top as soon as the sun hit it. And in that moment, I knew that that's what spirit or soul was. It wasn't some person in the sky watching over us and telling us what to do. It was everything that vibrated and was energetic in this experience. And for me, that's important because if we can understand ourselves not as the physical matter or the bodies that are walking around this earth, but as the energy that's driving that body, then our connection to each other is richer because every single one of us is moved by that same energy, regardless of the shape, the size, the form, the nationality, the religion, the gender that we might show up as. And if we can understand that, then this idea of unity consciousness, this idea that we are all one consciousness in this video game, having this experience, allows for a little more compassion and a little bit more understanding and hopefully a little less violence and aggression towards each other for our differences.
I couldn't agree more. I find that the more you tap into this idea of universal consciousness or, unconditional unified love, the less that we also want to destroy the planet, right? The more community focused we become, right? And there's new research that's starting to show that having some form of spiritual practice, and, this is not dogmatic, it's not religious, but just some form of spiritual practice that is personally meaningful, maybe even in a group setting, if that's what you're craving, is actually incredibly healing and actually helps mental health. And I think, cultures all around the world for thousands of years have known this.
Yep.
It just takes us a little bit of time to catch up with science.
Yes, we've always communed together. All religions congregate. There's always been a community aspect to worshiping God, source creator. And I think the reason for that is because of that connection to each other that we seem to have lost sight of in modern civilizations because we're so individually focused that we've disconnected from each other. And one of the biggest things, that most people struggle with is a feeling of not belonging and needing to be seen and needing to be witnessed. And if we can recognize ourselves as that soul primarily, that energy that keeps this body alive, then I can connect to you energetically, which we do, whether we realize it or not, right? I mean, we have language for it. We get a vibe. There was tension in the room. Like, what are you sensing? There's no actual physical tension. There's a sensation, there's an energy. So if we can recognize that energetic connection, I think our sense of loneliness disappears, our sense of belonging increases, and our sense of tolerance for each other automatically improves, right?
100%. There's craving in most of us for meaning. To be part of something bigger than just ourselves.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, we call it legacy, we call it purpose. And I think that we've misinterpreted those words, and we've, at least through the lens of North American culture, we've made it productivity based. And I think that that's a hijacking of spirit.
Yes, very much so.
But having more meaning, being part of something bigger, that is a sense of belonging, as you're talking about. And so, throughout this podcast, we're going to dive a bit deeper into that. But for now, Gina, what is important from your perspective about the observer self?
The observer self is the part of us that is able to maintain neutrality in any experience. And very few of us operate from that place. I use this example with clients. If I were to pick up a cup, the observer in me is going to view that as a cup, a container, maybe with a handle that's a certain size and volume that I can put things in. And I could put water in there, I could put cereal in there. And I don't have an opinion about the cup. I just know by looking at it that it is in fact a cup. And being able to maintain that neutrality in any circumstance allows for a more objective reaction to that circumstance rather than a subjective one. And if I'm able to maintain neutrality, then there's a lot less room for aggression and violence and animosity and so on, because I'm not making the circumstance subjective. And so in terms of finding a resolution, the opportunity to make a resolution that is more neutral and more fair and more rational is higher when I'm in my observer self rather than in my emotional, defensive, or ego self.
Absolutely. So I always call it factual reality, right? The ability to be in and experience factual reality versus the story that I'm laying on top. And the story is usually something that is personal. And so it will often feel like a personal attack or a personal trigger because there's this personal meaning. And it could be something as simple as, this person didn't call me. That's fact. The story I layer on top is because they don't love me.
Right.
And that makes the experience much more painful.
Right.
Right. And that brings us into the third part of the self, which is the ego self. And this is the part of the self that makes those stories. This is the part of self that needs to create meaning.
And it originates in childhood. So children are egocentric. We process the world by internalizing it as tiny humans because we don't have any other framework to understand it. And when we are children, a large part of our processing is sensation before it's emotion or thought. And our inability to handle sensation causes us to experience sensation as discomfort. And if there's discomfort, we will then at some point need to make sense of what's going on for us in order to navigate it. And that's where the meaning making starts.
Absolutely. And in a big way, it's to try to not experience the discomfort again.
Exactly. So we make up a story, and because we're children, those stories are not logical or rational, because our ability to make logical sense of things doesn't start till puberty, which is when the neocortex starts its myelination, and our higher reasoning and functioning don't start till after that point, which means from 0 to puberty, we essentially make nonsense of things. That meaning-making machine makes up stories that are extremely illogical, very emotional, and we don't always have the ability to recognize that they're not coming from a grounded place till well into adulthood.
Absolutely. We're going to explore more about how these fundamental stories in childhood often become the foundations of our trauma and how we can rectify that. But for the purposes of this podcast, we're just going to stick with the ego itself. I want to make sure that we talk about how the ego is not bad.
Nope.
There's a lot, I think, of misinterpretation of the ego as something that we need to destroy or get rid of. We have to clean out all the karma. But we couldn't exist in this human form without an ego.
Right.
Because we would be basically wide open. I think of the ego as a filtration system.
Yeah.
We just need to get it the correct context.
Exactly. We need to help it analyze more rationally and more logically so that it isn't all subjective.
Absolutely. We also need to help bring choice back into the equation, because usually when we're in discomfort, we become reactionary, which is when we will often default to the meanings that we made growing up. There's an analogy that I really love that I think works really well when we talk about the ego, that when you have a computer that's just the tech, right? That's the human body, the brain. The software, we have to build that.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's what the ego is. It's sort of like a software program. And so unless we update the code, the program is not going to work the way that we need it to in the future, because it was based on old technology or old belief systems.
Right. And we have to make sure there aren't any viruses or malware in that program that might corrupt the operating. And so the ego comprises of our lived experiences and our interpretations of those experiences based on the levels of discomfort we went through. It also holds all of the expectations that were placed on us, the obligations we grew up with that might be traditional or religious or cultural, the indoctrination, whether it's patriarchal, post-colonial. We as children don't have the ability to discern how much of what we are being taught aligns with us, so we absorb it all. And if we don't like it, we may state that, but we can't do much to not participate in it because the expectations are placed on us by parents and family, and we don't have the voice yet to, contest that or fight it. And so that ego might be holding beliefs and programs that we don't actually align with, that we don't actually want to follow. But because we were exposed to it, it sits in that background, running and impacting that operating system. And so understanding what's in the ego is crucial so that you are able to then take away or remove what you don't align with and maintain the programs and systems that you actually feel are in keeping with your authentic self.
Absolutely. Part of that work is looking at and exploring how the anticipated consequences of not following along with those paradigms as a child don't exist in the same way as an adult. And yet the fear is still there because those consequences to some degree were real and or were threatened.
Right.
Because, nobody is perfectly healthy in our society. There's no such thing.
No. Parents are well-intentioned, but don't always know how some actions are causing harm.
Absolutely. And so much of what the ego holds is emotional information, which brings us into the fourth part of self, which is the emotional self. And as human beings, regardless of our gender, we all experience every aspect of life, even our thoughts, through an emotional lens. And the body, it's a really interesting thing. It can't tell the difference between physical external reality and an internal thought. And so I will have a similar physiological response. Let's say my heart rate will increase, whether there's a real lion or I'm imagining a lion coming to me. It's why we have such intense responses to movies.
Right.
Gina, do you want to talk a little bit about the emotions?
Yeah, we as a collective have somehow decided that certain emotions are welcome in our spaces and then some emotions are absolutely unwelcome in our spaces. And we seem to have collectively agreed that the so-called positive emotions are okay and the so-called negative ones are not. And I don't believe emotions are positive or negative. I believe all emotions are information. And if we have a healthy relationship with emotions, then we will be functional adult human beings. And when we do not have a healthy relationship with all emotions, we become dysfunctional. And so the emotional self is the part of us that holds the emotions that we were taught to tolerate and the ones that we were taught to repress. So even if you don't consciously have a connection with the emotion, your body is still experiencing it. You just may not be aware of that experience because you've repressed your awareness of it. And that emotional self drives so many of our behaviors because unregulated emotions become intolerable. And if we maintain an unhealthy relationship with any emotion, we're holding that intensity in the body. Our brains then have to act in defense of that emotion because it senses it as a threat. It would feel uncomfortable. And so that drives our behaviors.
Absolutely. It's a little bit even more complex because not only are some emotions viewed as okay and some are not, they're also heavily gendered.
Yes.
And so what women or assigned women were able to feel is very different than what assigned men or men were able to feel.
Yes.
And this is also true culturally, religiously.
Yep.
Right? Some religions, for example, really love guilt.
Yes.
I would call it toxic guilt, which we're going to talk about in a podcast later in this podcast order. But the emotions really are a big key to so many things.
Historically, women were conditioned away from anger because it was not ladylike, and men were conditioned away from sadness because it wasn't manly.
Or everything but anger.
Right. And if we don't have, as human beings, access to both grief and anger, then we're not going to be functional because as women, we still feel angry and we need to be able to address that and express that in a way that is healthy. And as men, of course, you're going to feel sad about things that are sad or scared about things that are scary. But if you're never allowed to feel those feelings, you will not be able to express them in a way that is healthy, which means you will be dysfunctional in that emotional expression. And the emotional self holds all of those experiences, waiting for regulation so that it can actually be healthy. So understanding what the emotional self actually is, what your relationship with emotion is very important for you to become a functioning adult.
The emotional self is also the language of our needs. If we don't have access to the full range of emotions, and each emotion has a call to action, we'll explore that in another episode, we won't be able to know what our needs are. And so we're going to just have to try everything to try to soothe ourselves. And unfortunately, a lot of times we outsource to our partners or our children or our friends, and it doesn't usually go very well.
Yeah, or we might outsource to things like substances or processes and we develop addictions because we're trying to run away from the uncomfortable feelings that we have not or don't feel capable of processing. And so we use food, drugs, sex, alcohol to try and manage that emotional pain that's coming up. And of course, it doesn't end well.
Which segues us nicely into the defensive self, which is the part of self that analyzes and responds to threat. And whatever emotion or thought or belief system or experience that we have learned is threatening based on how we grew up and the experiences that we have had, the defensive self is going to call into action. The defensive self is going to either try to numb, dismiss, deflect, gaslight. Brene Brown has an amazing bucket of information, I'm going to call it, called the Shame Shields.
Yeah.
And I highly recommend anyone listening to this to check out Brene Brown's Shame Shields. But the defensive self really is our way to try to create safety, to get rid of discomfort. It is survival. It just, unfortunately, because it's dealing with the ego, which is a meaning-making machine that often makes meaning incorrectly, and a lot of repressed emotions, it often means that our defensive system is reacting to things that aren't factually real.
Or things that were real historically that are no longer occurring, things that have been left in the body because we did not have that emotional regulation skill and we didn't move those emotions out of our system. And the mind can't tell the difference between past, present, or future. If I'm feeling it in this moment, then it is real. And then the meaning-making ego will show up and interpret, and then the defensive brain acts in defense of that pain. And defenses can be a range of different things. They can be thought-based defenses, so overthinking, catastrophic thinking, OCD type thoughts.
Anxiety,
a lot of negative self-talk and criticism, things like that. They can be emotional. So defenses can also be emotional, where you're feeling one emotion, but maybe you don't know that you can access it or you're not allowed to access it. So for example, females who feel angry, who have been exposed to dynamics or circumstances where anger was not allowed, will forego anger for grief, and instead of being angry, they'll cry. Or men who feel sad or scared, but again weren't allowed to have access to those emotions, may choose anger as a defense if the grief or the sadness is coming up. Defenses can be behavioral, so addiction-based behaviors, but also things like people pleasing and overachieving and perfectionism, scapegoating, sabotage. There's so many ways that we look to protect ourselves from that unconscious pain material, and we don't realize it.
Even OCD, panic, agoraphobia, schizophrenia, these are all defensive patterns that are part of the defensive self. There's a great example that I know a lot of people experience, depending on the age range of the listeners. I know that this was an experience that I've had, where a certain generation was raised with the cried out method, where they were left to cry in the crib until they stopped. And this was actually a trauma.
Yep.
And we call it a nonverbal trauma because it happens before we had language. And for many of us, we will actually experience an intense rush of adrenaline, shock, or panic if we wake up in the night. And I always wondered myself as I was exploring this pattern, like, there's not, like, I'm safe, there's nothing wrong, like, it's not like I'm gonna die if I don't get enough sleep. Where is this reaction coming from? And it was only through deep brain reorienting that I realized this was what was stuck in my nervous system from being traumatized through the cried out method, right? And so the defensive self went into complete threat over something as simple as waking up in the night.
Right.
And in next episode, we're going to dive deeper into why self-awareness is so important. But in summary, the self is the lens through which we experience this life. And it is deeply important to understand, because then we have a chance of meeting our needs and actually creating the future outcomes that we're looking for.
And the self is extremely complex. We've broken it down into these 5 parts to sort of simplify it, but if only things were ever that simple. Our self is nuanced and intertwined with not just all the ways that we experience this life and all the ways that we were conditioned by this life, but also by every experience and encounter we have every single day of our lives. And being able to interpret those encounters from a more neutral observer self with that soul that knows that we are interconnected and come from this place of consciousness makes this life significantly gentler and easier to navigate.
So thank you so much for joining us on this journey of exploring ourselves. I'm Charlotte.
And I'm Gina, and we are the Lighthouse Keepers.